Who Jumbo Espresso Talk Today community. It's Amma Robin here. Aquaba to the Espresso Talk Today podcast show. Welcome to the show. I hadn't planned to stay in this weekend. I had really big plans to go out, but I decided to stay home. Why? Well, it was raining, storming actually. Lightning, thunder, high winds, dark skies, the whole shebang. This was a full-on storm. You may know that I live in Belgium, and honestly, Belgium can hold its own with really bad storms against almost any country. So I decided to stay home. Actually, because I'm trying to see the positive in things, the storm had made the house feel warm and cozy. So this was an opportunity. As I saw it, I had two available options. This is from my point of view. Netflix and reading. And honestly, I've been Netflix binging way too much lately, though I found some really interesting, great shows. But I decided to take Netflixing off the list. Yes, that's a word, Netflixing. I just created it. So this actually created the perfect setup for me to spend some time reading. ETT listeners know how much I love to read anyway. And I just got some great new books on Afrofuturism, so that was really an option for me. But as usual, my work responsibilities were also tugging at me. So I decided to combine reading with a project for work. And can you guess what I pulled out to read? I know, you guessed it. Transcriptions. Transcriptions of Espresso Talk Today podcast shows. And I am so glad that I did. It was great reading, and I got so many great ideas. You know, I've heard these shows before. I was there when they were recorded. These shows with the experts, I was there. I was part of the conversation. But when I went back and read these transcripts, I learned even more. Let me explain. Over the past 2 years, for people who are regular listeners for this show, over the past years, we've had many experts on the show for our uncommon conversations. We've had psychologists, public health experts, epidemiologists, medical doctors. We've had an expert in Black psychology, financial advisors, storytellers, lots of other people, lots of other experts who have brought their unique skills, perspectives, and their incredible expertise to the show. We've really been honored that they've been so generous to share their time and their experience with us. We've learned a lot. I've learned a lot. And we hope that you have too. Now, this gave me a great idea. Reading usually does give me great ideas. My idea was to create a show with some of the best excerpts from some of the amazing experts that we've had on the show. And that's what we're going to do today. And actually, I found so many that we're going to do 2 shows with excerpts. So we're going to continue this next week. So for me, today's show is really special because we have not 1, not 2, but we have 3 experts on the show. Or to be more precise, we have 3 excerpts from experts on the show. We're going to get to it in a minute, but let me just tell you about our 3 experts today. First, we have Dr. Georges Benjamin, discussing the importance of public health in Black and Brown communities. Second, we have Professor Theopia Jackson, discussing Black psychology and racial trauma. And third, we have Professor Howard Stevenson, discussing racial literacy and racial encounters. Asante Sana for joining us today, community. Let's get to it. Our first expert today is Dr. Georges Benjamin. Dr. Benjamin is a well-known health policy leader, practitioner, and administrator. He currently serves as the Executive Director of the American Public Health Association, the nation's oldest and largest organization for public health professionals. He's also a former Secretary of Health, for the state of Maryland. Dr. Benjamin is a graduate of the Illinois Institute of Technology and the University of Illinois College of Medicine. He's also board certified in internal medicine. In this excerpt, Dr. Benjamin discusses the meaning and importance of public health and how public health is working to achieve health equity. Let's get to it. One thing I learned about when I started, researching more of this was that I had no idea what public health is about. And I always thought, okay, measles, all right, if there's a measles outbreak, then public health steps in. And I think that was really my kind of limited vision of it. But when I started researching, I saw Dr. Benjamin, your quote here on public health is founded on the principle of social justice as a basic right. And I'm a big social justice person. So that really got my attention and it really helped me to think I really have to learn more. So I'm going to start with the basic question. What is public health? What is it about? What does it do?
Well, sure. Public health is what we as a society do to ensure the conditions for people to be healthy. So if you think of health, and I like to think of a holistic approach to health, being it more, it's not just a presence or absence of disease, but it is also well-being. It's good mental health. And it's a sense of just being at one with the rest of the universe in many ways. Now that sounds metaphysical and all that kind of stuff, but practically, if you think about what it means, and if you think about health as this huge collection of things from the most important parts of wellness all the way to the people that do the most complicated theoretical procedures on people to put us back the way we used to be, when we injure ourselves or get sick. Public health is population health. So when I was practicing emergency medicine, and someone came in with a rat bite, I'd fix the rat bites, okay? But if 10 people come in with rat bites, you're not going to do any good unless you go out and get rid of the rats. So public health thinks about things in a broad sense. What can we do, not just for the individual, but for people by the tens, by the thousands, by the millions? So when you think about, we do a lot of our work through policy, and it could be such things as requiring seatbelts or limiting people's access to tobacco, because when you do that, you can impact a lot more people each and every day. In other words, if you could prevent people from having automobile crashes in the first place, then we don't have to fix them when they crash their Chevy.
Okay. So, how do you compare? So, if I break my leg or I have a rat bite, I go to my doctor, I get treated for that. And so that's basically clinical. That's not public health until it becomes. It's
not public health. And let's put it in terms that people are thinking about today. So this terrible tragedy of COVID.
Right.
An individual clinician gives you a vaccination, and we think of that as clinical medicine. But when we give enough vaccines to enough people that we actually interrupt the infection, the disease's path, then you're really practicing public health. So it certainly can be an individual clinical intervention, but public health is the concept that if we vaccinate enough people, we can protect people from getting the disease and passing it along. If we wear a mask, wash our hands, keep our distance, those are public health interventions. And while they may be done on an individual basis, the goal is to protect the broad population. And that's the way we see the world. And we try to do this in a way that's equitable and just. And that's also a core tenet of public health is health equity.
Health equity. Okay, going back just 1 second. So how is this a social justice issue? Is it, or you're about to go into that?
Well, it is a social justice issue because we believe that you cannot achieve any of the other things that you like to have in society. You cannot have the prosperous life that you want unless you're healthy. Health is clearly a fundamental human right. I know they didn't write that in the Constitution, but they did write some things in the Constitution about being able to be prosperous. They wrote some things in the Constitution about being able to be free.
Yeah.
And those things you cannot have unless you have a really the health and well-being. Unhealthy children can't learn, and unhealthy adults can't work. You don't work, you don't eat. You don't eat, you don't have any other kind of prosperous future. So it connecting all the dots. Health is at the center of everything that we do. Well, the way I think about it is, if it hurts people or kills people, it's ours. And that means that when you think about things, there's a health in all policies approach to all the things that we do in society. So yeah, poverty has a health implication. We know that health is directly coordinated with wealth. Mm-hmm. And so to the extent that we can, again, try to make sure people have the means to maintain their health, it's going to be very important. And public health works very hard to do that.
And education, does public health do anything with education?
Oh, absolutely. So we also talk about the fact that about 80% of what makes you healthy occurs outside the doctor's office. Now, I got to tell you, as an ER doc who spent a fair amount of time, working in emergency departments, helping put people back together. And, it's a very painful revelation to know that what I did was very important.
Yeah.
But again, the more people that I can keep out of the emergency department, because the injury didn't happen in the first place, the heart disease, the heart attack, the stroke didn't happen. All of those things are very important. So we talk about that 80% as the the social determinants of health. And they include a range of things from education, housing, transportation. And you think about this. Now, we know, for example, a child's survivability is related to his mother's education. All right. There's a correlation that's been done in every society that's actually looked at it on the planet, that the more education the mom has, the more likely that child is to live beyond their first birthday.
Wow.
Now, that's probably a surrogate for a range of other societal activities, but it works. And high school education, we know that people who get a high school education and graduate from high school, from a health perspective, do better than people that don't. If you think about transportation, now we want communities to be walkable, bikeable, and green, and we want people to exercise and those kinds of things. But transportation is your gateway to do lots of things. So those of us from Chicago know that many years ago, we got a wonderful train system in Chicago, the L, right? Gets you around most of the city. But several years ago, they closed a lot of the stations on the west side of the city.
I remember that.
Remember that? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So how do those people get to work? How do those people get to a doctor's office?
They don't.
They don't. No, they don't. If they don't have a car, they're out of luck. We know that during COVID, that many of the testing sites were not in the hood. Mm-hmm. And because they weren't there, people, we told people, look, if you're not feeling well, go get tested. And then we put the testing sites so far away from people who did not feel well and did not have a car. And by the way, they're disproportionately communities of color. So not surprising that people weren't getting tested. If you didn't have a car and you weren't going to take 2 trains and a bus to get there, right? Particularly if you weren't feeling well. And then what do we do with vaccinations? We repeated the mistake, right? We sent people to the vaccinations instead of putting the vaccinations to the people. And what do we end up with? That plus, some other issues around vaccine confidence. We had huge disparities in who got the vaccine. So the society that we live in dramatically impacts this. Um, and I would say there are five, well, let's talk about four things that really impact health inequities.
Okay.
The meaning that people don't have equal access to health care. One, access to health insurance coverage,
Okay.
right? We live in a system that has a get in the system card, and we call that the insurance card. And of course, there's gradations in the quality of that card too. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, the big issue is not having access to healthcare. And it's more than an insurance card, I know, but fundamentally it's access to care. Secondly, differences in the quality of care received in the healthcare setting. We know that people get differences in the quality of care we receive, either because there are places that are better than others, and sometimes people are differentially treated.
Yeah.
Third, differences in health-seeking behavior. We know that people seek health differently based on access, cost, experience, how they've been treated, and other myths and beliefs and disbeliefs in what the healthcare system can do for them. And then finally, a whole range of these social determinants that we just talked about that either help you or impede you from getting into the system. And by the way, racism and discrimination falls within that social determinants bucket of things. So those four things drive the inequities that we see today in health.
Dr. Benjamin ended this by talking about the inequities that we see today in health. Thank you, Dr. Georges Benjamin, for that introduction to public health. Our second expert for today is Dr. Theopia Jackson. Dr. Jackson is a clinical psychologist focusing her practice on models of care that are informed by African-centered principles. Dr. Jackson previously served as president of the Association of Black Psychologists from 2019 to 2021. That's when we met her at Espresso Talk Today. The Association of Black Psychologists was founded in 1968 to address the problems facing Black psychologists and to have a positive impact on the mental health of the national Black community. And I gotta mention it, Dr. Jackson is an HBCU grad. In this excerpt, Dr. Jackson focuses on the meaning of trauma as a universal human experience and the unique experience and impact of racial trauma. Let's get to it.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, Dr. Jackson, was you have a certification in the complexities of racial trauma. And I'm not really exactly sure what the complexities of racial trauma are. I know there are different, forms of trauma, microaggressions and things like that. But how does that, how do you use that, in Black psychology?
Wonderful question again. First, just to clarify what we mean by trauma. Trauma is, in fact, a universal experience. Everyone will go through a point in time in their life when they're exposed to something that is deeply painful. May it be the premature death of a loved one, particularly if you are a 5-year-old child and you've lost your parent, right? So trauma is a human experience. But there are multiple ways in which trauma can show up. The example I just gave is a natural one, right? That people do die. However, there are also imposed traumas where someone's been murdered, taken from you. And then there's also, so those are direct experiences of the trauma. But there's also, we call type 1, if it's really happening to you, if you're someone who's a survivor of sexual abuse, type 1 trauma. There's also type 2, where you are still impacted even though you're not the direct, quote, victim. So the child of a woman who's been raped may experience type 2 trauma because it can be assumed that the mother's traumatic experience of the rape and her recovery has a direct impact in how she mothers. how she is in the world. If she's struggling with her own depression around this and can't get out of bed, it has an impact on the child's growth. So it's type 1, type 2, first and foremost, to be clear for our audiences. Now I ask you to expand that further. There are multiple generations of unresolved trauma. Let's stay with the theory of rape. This young woman who's experienced rape and never went for care, yet is having strong reactions to it. May it be increased depression, which is it's impacting her quality of life. May it be quick tempers and anger, which she just is having a hard time loving and allowing herself to be loved. It impacts her child. That child grows up in that atmosphere, and it impacts who they're going to be in the world and how they choose their mates and how they begin to parent if this has not been interrupted. So this is how the trauma of one generation can impact all the way down the line. A more familiar story around this is appreciating the story of our families and people who've survived the Holocaust, right? We clear generations are still contending with that traumatic event. People who are coming from here in the Native Americans here in the United States, their walk of tears, all kinds. So you can have traumatic events that can happen at the individual level as well as a collective level. For myself, as a direct descendant of those Africans who were trafficked to the United States in 1619, that trauma would be the period of enslavement, the 200 plus years that generations were being dehumanized, where a white master had the right to rape and impregnate a 10-year-old child because he owned her, right? And as well as a 10-year-old boy, let's be clear about this, because he owned him. They had no rights to their own language, their own culture, even though at that period of time they could choose a mate, but that mate was not really theirs because the master had a right to break it up at any given time. So they were not humans. They were clearly no different than a cattle. And more importantly, there were laws that said that these Black bodies were cattle. They were just like the horse that you own and everything else that can be traded, bartered, beaten, raped, what have you. I say that to say that even though I did not experience that direct trauma, the messaging of that, the pain of that has moved down by generations. And to my knowledge, the American Psychological Association and no other mental health professionals in the United States created the care to help recover from the psychological, emotional, and physical woundedness of being exposed to that type of collective trauma for so many years, as well as Jim Crow. So this is the context. So we're not saying everything is, quote, about the enslavement period, but we are saying that there's much that's been unaddressed and undealt with, including the fact to grieve. And we do have some people of African ancestry who do not even recognize that they're still impacted by that trauma. They're denying it. They too will say that's over and done with, nothing to do with me. And yet they're not recognizing that somehow they may be dealing with some internalized racism and trauma. So I'm going to close by saying, so that's how the racial trauma can move within a family or within the community, if you will. But the racial trauma is still an environmental issue because it's still happening to us. I would submit that the murder of Brother Floyd, who I now say is the murder that was felt around the world, is complete evidence that racial trauma still exists. Because if you look deeply at the face of that white police officer, we're going to assume in here that he is a, quote, good father, good person, good human being. You have to ask yourself what happened in his psyche that he could do what he did to another body like that unaffected.
Right.
Evidence of racial trauma. And what I would also say is you have to shift this conversation about racial trauma from simply looking at the impact on the targeted group, the victim, and instead expand it to say, what is going on with the psyche of those who perpetuate it?
So are we still passing that trauma on to our children? Is that
Absolutely. Yes.
so? What can we do, if anything, to minimize that or eliminate it altogether? Maybe we can't eliminate it, but what should we be doing?
Great question. Like any illness, and that's what this is, the first thing is to name it and to discuss it. How do we have good critical conversations that are age appropriate and family accessible around what it means for us to be Black and the ways in which we have messaged good messages to each other and ourselves or painful ones? And I'm going to give the example of the painful one. In many of our communities, we know, excuse my language, we know we can call a child out of their name, which is already bad in of itself, to call them, that B word.
Mhm.
But we also know we start saying Black B, like somehow putting Black before it makes it that much more of more of a punch. Those are some of the ways in which we're perpetuating the storiedness that there's something wrong with being Black, right? Our challenges with colorism, our in-house, our family challenges when we are, quote, privileging this thing called good hair and light skin over darkness and kinky. Those are some of the ways in which we inadvertently collude with the madness around us to perpetuate racial trauma. So therefore, we must be more intentional to use our words carefully, to be intentional to lift up our children and in age appropriate ways, to speak to their brilliance, to truly believe in their brilliance and love them in this, and to shore them up and to let them know that racism does exist. It doesn't mean that every situation they find themselves in or every white person they interact with is racist. No, by no means at all. But Brother Kenneth Hardy, who's this Black psychologist, reminds us that we have to pay, that there's something called a healthy sense of paranoia, where we have to be, if I just got dissed in a line, overlooked, dismissed, or treated badly by a teller, I have to ask myself, wait, is the teller just having a bad day? Did I do something wrong about how I presented myself? Or could this be something about racism? Could it be something about genderism? We have to begin to, in a very quick way, foster this type of an analysis to check and see, because when we understand what's happening to us, then we can make good, clear decisions as to how we want to respond. So this can be done in an age-appropriate way for our children, and teaching them, first of all, mirroring back to them the goodness of who they are. So there should be images in the house of good, positive Black images, positive Black books, along with all the other traditional books that anyone would read. It doesn't have to all be about Blackness, but it should definitely be in there, right? As well as the critical conversations, the movies we choose to watch, and how we engage in conversations. The Disney movies are perfect examples. In some ways, they have been culprits in perpetuating negative imaging of people of color while we're still enjoying it. And I'm not to say we can't enjoy it, but how do you have good conversations afterwards? And I'll give a snippet of an example that comes up for me as I'm learning now to be a grandmother as to a 9-year-old, as my son has a stepdaughter, and I'm blessed in this space. But she said to me one day, we were talking, and she had talked about a little white lie. You see, so I'm curious, why in this day and age is a 9-year-old talking about, I said, so baby, what does that mean? Well, it's kind of wrong, but it's not completely wrong. And remember Dr. Martin Luther King's messaging. So it's obviously still happening.
Thank you, Dr. Theopia Jackson, for your discussion about naming and controlling racial trauma. Our third and final expert for today is Dr. Howard Stevenson. Dr. Stevenson is an expert on resolving racial stress and trauma that affect health at every stage of life. His work prepares children and adults to assert themselves during face-to-face microaggressions that undermine academic and work productivity. Dr. Stevenson has served for 32 years as a clinical psychologist working in under-resourced rural and urban neighborhoods across the country. He's a professor of Africana Studies at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania, and currently the executive director of the Racial Empowerment Collaborative. His book, Promoting Racial Literacy in Schools, Differences That Make a Difference, summarizes his groundbreaking work. And on a personal note, I can say that Dr. Stevenson's book is an incredible resource for managing racial encounters and racial stress. Honestly, is one of the books that I carry with me, that I travel with, more than any other, because the information is so helpful and his personal stories are so relatable. And I'm really serious about this. Someone could look in my backpack right now and they would find this book. That's how much I'm learning from it. Again, it's called Promoting Racial Literacy in Schools, Differences That Make a Difference. In this excerpt, Dr. Stevenson discusses assessing one's ability to cope with racially stressful moments, developing racial socialization skills, and he's going to define what those mean, and developing racial literacy skills and why those are important. He also identifies the important differences between racial stress and racial trauma. Let's get to it.
Sure.
So there have been a lot of terms that I've noticed just in your talks and other research, but I don't seem to fully understand them. So for example, racial literacy, racial socialization, and racial self-efficacy. Could you explain them and how these different concepts fit together?
So, racial coping self-efficacy is about the notion of how well do I believe that I can cope or navigate a racially stressful moment. And so, in order to understand that, a racially stressful moment is in some respects a moment in which a racial situation, aspect, knowledge comes up, and I feel out of sorts. What Shelley Harrell out of Pepperdine calls, I'm overtaxed. And I find myself so overtaxed and overwhelmed that I fail or struggle to regulate my feelings. And most people think stress is about feelings, but it's not just about feelings. It's about my thoughts and my body reaction. So imagine if I'm stressed on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being extremely stressed, 1 not being stressed. It means I'm overwhelmed in regulating my feelings, my thoughts, and my body reactions all in the same time. And so racial coping self-efficacy is how much do I believe I can manage my stressful self, the stress of the situation, how other people treat me. So do I have a high belief that I can do it, or do I not really believe that I can do it? And building self-efficacy is part of the work that we do in intervention. Racial socialization is how well do parents prepare their children for racial stressful moments or racial hostility or hate. And I would also add racial uplift, right? How to prepare our children about positive notions about who we are. That's just as important as preparing them for danger. And so part of that includes not only what parents say to children, content, but it also includes what children say to parents. So it's multi-directional. It's not just coming from adults to children. We get socialized about race from social media, from peers, from school policies, from television, from just about anywhere. And some would argue that it's not verbal, it's nonverbal. We watch other people do stuff and that communicates to us. We watch our parents, they don't say, but we see when they're upset, we see when they hesitate. And if that's happening in a racial moment, children can take from that a lesson. And then the other thing you mentioned, racial socialization, and I think I've forgotten the other thing that you mentioned, racial coping self-efficacy, racial socialization, you said one more.
And the other one was racial literacy.
Okay. So let's say in racial socialization is what parents say to their kids. You have to work twice as hard as a Black person to be thought of as equal as a white person. That's a common statement we get when we talk to families and children. Or you have to be proud to be Black or brown, right? Some parents have protect their children by talking about those things. Some parents, though, protect their children by not talking about those things. They don't want to ruin their childhood. And so even that's a form of socialization, to not talk about race. But what we have learned is that the research on racial socialization is that the more parents talk to their children about race, and we were the first to ask teenagers, what did your parents actually say to you? Because we know sometimes what parents say they say to their children isn't always what children say their parents say to them. But either angle, whatever you look at in the research, whether parents or adolescents are saying, the more you talk about it, the better children end up on indices and measures of academic achievement, academic motivation. Even we know more around sleep benefits from talking about race for third graders to sixth graders. A recent study came out. So from preschool to adulthood, the benefits of talking about race are more likely to be positive than negative or neutral. The problem is that some parents, when they talk to their children about race, they're explicit. Others are not explicit. I joke, my dad would say, look, if you lay down with dogs, you're going to get up with fleas. And we're supposed to figure out the civil rights message in that statement. Dad, what does that mean? We don't have dogs. We got a lot of cats, but we don't have dogs. Anyway, I would never say that to my father. It was always in my mind and under my breath. But that's what was going on in my head. And when we talk to children around, parents say, be proud to be Black. You have to work twice as hard. Those are vague. They're not really helping me when somebody's coming at me in less than 2 minutes. So racial literacy is an attempt to build the skill sets for what you need to do if you only had 2 minutes to make a decision. How much more skillful must I be to navigate a racially stressful moment? And that's where we teach more about how to regulate your emotions when you're overwhelmed, how to use mindfulness when you actually are finding yourself at a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, and your body's going this way, and your thoughts are going that way, and your feelings are someplace else. So that's my quick and dirty version.
Well, that's really amazing to sort all of these out. But how does that fit in what racial stress is and what racial trauma is? Are they different or the same?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to differentiate the two, define them.
One wonderful question, and I think there are multiple ways people try to distinguish. I have generally thought about stress as something that happens if you think about the larger context of this country. We are a country that has failed to resolve the larger tension of race and racial enslavement in this country, which and we've also been very forceful at not talking about it. So we're very skilled at not talking about race, which increases the chances that whenever race comes up, we're going to be bothered by it. And because we were taught, oh my gosh, this is a taboo, or some people are going to get hurt, or I don't know how I'll look incompetent, or people will call me a blank. So racial stress is high, really because of the larger context that we won't really resolve it or talk about it. And this is centuries long kinds of coping. But stress tends to be something that can be immediate. It doesn't linger forever, but it does affect how you function. It affects how you make decisions. If I'm stressed at a high level, I'm not a great decision maker. In fact, Claude Steele talks about in his book, Whistling Vivaldi, A Racing Mind, that if we are in a racial moment, we are so stressed sometimes that our brains will go on lockdown because we're trying to not say the wrong thing. We're trying to get it right. We're trying not to be called a blank. So if we get to that high level of stress, at an 8, 9, and 10, let's just say, our brain can go on lockdown and we can lose peripheral vision and hearing, right? And if it's a crisis, that's a helpful process. But if it's not a crisis and we're distorting something that's normal, but into a crisis, we have made ourselves really lousy decision makers, right? And so the strategies we propose is, what if we opened up your decision, your left and right visual and hearing possibilities? How much more information, how much better decision maker you are. So stress disrupts decision making, disrupts memory, it disrupts access to memory, but it affects your body and as well as your feelings. Trauma, on the other hand, is, what if that sense of stress lingers and doesn't go away? So what Dr. Smith around the battle fatigue, he's a wonderful colleague, has talked about, what if you don't turn that meter off, that you're constantly, over time, it stays with you. That's what we think of as more trauma. And in fact, when you come into a situation that reminds you of something that happened before, it doesn't matter how much longer before, it may trigger you to feel like you're right back there in that scenario. So stress, we think of as more temporary. Trauma, we think of as more persistent, as stress that does not dissipate leads us to not forget.
I thought stress could be over time, that, eventually, stress could actually cause you to have physical symptoms, like heart issues and hypertension, high blood pressure, things like that. But trauma would be like a one shot thing, a traumatic event happens. But you're saying that's different?
Yes, in the sense that what people do name as an insult to your body, as a traumatic event, is different than the way that I would be using it here around trauma that stays with you. Prolonged stress, though, can lead to what we think of as emotional lingering trauma, as opposed to a physical assault, which is traumatic to the body itself. But we do know that stress affects and can happen in moments to disrupt a person and also affect their well-being in the moment. But you are right that prolonged stress affects cardiovascular health issues, particularly in Black and brown people, around not just stress, but racial stress is unique in producing or connected to cardiovascular health issues like breast cancer, like a host of issues that we know across the board, from diabetes to different types of cancers and longevity of life.
So would racial stress be more prevalent in, say, younger than older people, or it's just it doesn't? I mean, it has nothing to do with age.
Has nothing to do with age. In fact, we know that children as young, very young, can pick up when other people feel differently about them. And it doesn't have to just be about what they say, but how they're treated. In the same way that some places use good touch, bad touch to help kids know and report to parents if somebody is not treating them fairly, it is a recognition that children can pick up something that's not right for them, or how they're feeling, or how they're treated. So stress has no respect of age in that regard. And the question is, can we teach people how to notice when they're stressed, right? Because we are also a culture that avoids race. It means we are also very skilled to not see when race bothers us.
Thank you, Dr. Howard Stevenson, for introducing us to racial literacy skills and for discussing the important difference and impact between racial stress and racial trauma. This is where we will stop for today. I hope that you enjoyed hearing these excerpts from experts today as much as I did. Weren't they great? It was definitely worth hearing Dr. Georges Benjamin, Dr. Theopia Jackson, and Dr. Howard Stevenson again, even if only for a few minutes. But those minutes were powerful moments. I chose these excerpts, but I gotta say that it wasn't easy. how do you choose one excerpt when you have 10 or 15 or 20 that are so brilliant? Yes, I really did want to choose all of them, but of course, that would have defeated the point. But these excerpts that I did choose will give us a lot to think about and a lot to discuss. I do want to thank our experts, Georges Benjamin, Theopia Jackson, and Howard Stevenson, for meeting with us on the Espresso Talk Today podcast show and sharing their amazing work. I also want to give them a huge asante sana for the incredible and important work that they are doing now and that they've been doing for decades. Their work and research are saving and improving lives. Black and brown communities often are overlooked, ignored, or misunderstood. They're not included for important research studies, therapeutic work, and medical interventions and treatment. Instead, our communities are underfunded, overpoliced, stereotyped, and devalued. But these professionals are bringing it, and they're helping Black and brown individuals and communities. They're improving our physical, mental, and emotional health and well-being. They're on the front lines to stop the trauma of racism and to empower Black people. If these excerpts have whetted your appetite for more, and I hope they did, then you can find the published dates of these shows on the Espresso Talk Today website and hear the shows in their entirety. Wouldn't that be great? Next week, we will have excerpts from more experts who are on the front lines, and they're supporting Black health and well-being. They're honoring Black culture and empowering the Black community. Please send your comments and questions to us at team@espressotalktoday.com. And remember, you could always find us on Facebook at the Espresso Talk Today podcast show and on Facebook at Espresso Talk Today. By the way, Espresso Talk Today also supports the work of the American Public Health Association, the Association of Black Psychologists, and the Racial Empowerment Collaborative. They can use your support too. They're doing fantastic work. You can find more information about these organizations on the Espresso Talk Today website. Asante Sana for coming through this week and every week, dear community. And remember, now more than ever, strength, soul, and reparations. Ashe.